This is podcast number 5 for Chapter 10 on lesson planning. Before we leave the idea of writing lesson objectives, it's important to point out here that the EdTPA teacher performance assessment that we are concentrating on this semester in your teacher work sample stresses or encourages the use of academic language in your lesson plans. We designate at Winthrop at one cognitive objective in each lesson must contain some type of learning of academic language. Academic language is the technical language associated with movement proficiency and the movement context of physical education. Academic language in another subject area, such as music, would have to do with the technical language that's associated with music proficiency and teaching movement. All right. I'm sorry, teaching music. It's related to the idea of literacy. Students explore and experience abstract concepts about space, time, distance, and relationships, people, and objects. It must be taught in physical education through lesson objectives. The content in instructional tasks needs to be related to academic language. A good example is the word balance is a vocabulary word is part of our academic language in physical education. We know what balance means. We know that a wider base of support means that the body is more balanced. That is academic language or an example of academic language in physical education. As I said, one lesson objective in every lesson that you write must be focused on academic language. The parts of the lesson are pretty self-explanatory, but beginning a lesson we always have what we call a set induction, which is part of the introduction of the lesson. It tries to introduce the unit or the lesson or the content to the students. It focuses the students on what they're going to be learning that day, but it also motivates the students to try to learn what you're going to teach that particular day. In developing the lesson, we always try to use a wide variety of teaching strategies. You will always use more than one type of teaching strategy in every lesson that you do, whether you realize it or not. We do have direct teaching and command teaching or lecture teaching or whatever, but that's not even usually the only one that's used in a lesson. It's important to change the practice conditions for variety. Those are extensions sometimes that we use, and it's always important to use common sense about the physical demands of a lesson. Ending the lesson is also very important. There needs to be a distinct end to it, a closure to the lesson, where you review what happened in the lesson, but you also need to use that closure to either use assessments of the lesson and also to link this lesson, the present lesson that you just finished, to the next lesson that you're going to teach the next time you see the same class. It's called linking or chaining between lessons. The format for your Winthrop PETE or PEAT lesson plan starts with heading material, which is pretty self-explanatory, except that sometimes interns forget to put their names on the lesson. Be sure you put your name as the teacher. The most important part about the heading material is the equipment, the number of pieces of equipment that you need, and an exhaustive list of all of the equipment that needs to be set up and there available for the students and for you to teach. The lesson number is also important because it helps a supervisor know where you are in the unit and what possibly went before that particular lesson so that you look at the lesson. The quote there is on another slide, so I'm not going to go over that again. But the introduction that you have on your Winthrop lesson plan, of course, sets the tone for the whole lesson. It focuses the student, it reviews what happened in the last lesson, but it's written as a script of what you will likely say to introduce the lesson, word for word in quotes. Now that doesn't mean that we are going to take off points if you don't say those exact words that you put in the introduction, but we'd like you to formulate in your mind exactly what you're going to say to introduce the lesson. The introduction, by the way, is the only part of the lesson that is scripted like that. Most other parts of the lesson are bulleted lists of things or descriptions of things. The set induction is also called the anticipatory set. Again, that's during the introduction when you're trying to focus the learners and motivate them. An instant activity is a warm-up event for a vigorous physical activity, dribble tag for basketball. It should not be static stretching. We've talked about this for years now, and we've known this for years from the research, that instant activities where you do some type of cardiorespiratory activity or warm-up activity that's related to the content in the lesson is much more valuable than doing static stretching at the beginning of a lesson. Static stretching is better to do at the end of a lesson where you can improve flexibility. A continuation of that is an instant activity is sometimes called ASAP. Activity soon as possible is what that stands for. Again, cardiovascular activity to make the muscles warm and pliable, and static stretching has been shown by research to have no effect on preventing injury. In fact, it often causes injury. The warm-up should be related to the content being taught that day. The teacher objectives for the lesson are written just with the ABCCs, just like the lesson objectives are for students. They should be specific and observable. The content of these objectives is related to the weaknesses of the teacher, what he or she would like to work on during the lesson. Only 1 to 3 of these should be written on each lesson. A teacher can't concentrate on more than 1 or 2 things ourselves when we're trying to improve on our teaching abilities. An example of a teacher objective might be learning all of the students' names by the end of the period, or making contact with and giving feedback to every student in the class by the end of the period. In the assessment section, each assessment should be listed by the lesson objective. In other words, there should be an assessment that matches every objective that is written on the lesson plan, because the assessments are used to determine whether you've accomplished your objectives or not. If teacher observation is used as an assessment, and it shouldn't be done very often, the criteria must be listed in this section that you're going to use for the observation. What is it that you are looking for if you're using teacher observation? If questioning is used, especially as an assessment during the closure, the questions must be listed in this section. What are the assessment questions you're going to come up with to see whether the students have accomplished that objective? This slide gives you several different examples of teaching styles or strategies that you might use during the lesson. They must match the content, and therefore we have asked you on the Winthrop lesson plan to not only list the teaching styles and strategies, but to describe how you are using those teaching strategies within the lesson. There are direct types of teaching styles: command, lecture, interactive, demonstration, inquiry, where the teacher makes all or most of the decisions; semi-direct, which are peer or reciprocal style, peer teaching; stations or practice style, where students are making some of the decisions; and of course more indirect teaching strategies, which are actually better for student retention of learning: cooperative learning, problem solving, guided discovery, or critical thinking, where students make most of the teaching decisions. When the students are more responsible for their own learning, they have a tendency to remember and recall the information that they learned much better later on. There is a specific section on the Winthrop lesson plan that's listed as safety, technology, or special considerations. Safety means that you need to list all of the safety considerations that you need to teach the students that are specific to the lesson. You don't have to write on every single lesson that they need to wear tennis shoes to keep their feet safe and avoid injury. All right. This is the place where you need to put safety considerations specific to that lesson and what you are going to teach the students about that safety. This is important because of legal liability reasons. That's why we ask you to put these things on your lesson plans. That's another good reason for physical education teachers to actually write lesson plans. This is also the section that you would write down what technology you would use as a teacher, but more importantly, what type of technology the students will use in their learning of the lesson objectives. And then there will also be a section for special considerations. This would be facility alternatives in case of rain for an outdoor activity, sharing the gym with other classes that would make your space limited, periods shortened because of advising possibly or whatever. This would also be a good place to put any um, students with special needs that you might need to pay specific attention to and try to differentiate instruction for them. This is the end of podcast number 5 on Lesson Planning, Chapter 10.